Okay, so hello and welcome everybody to the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. Today we're very happy to welcome Stefan Bird-Pollan and Alistair Welchman. Stefan Bird-Pollan is Associate Professor of Philosophy, International Film Studies and Social Theory at the University of Kentucky in the USA. His wide range of research interests includes Kant, Hegel and German idealism, psychoanalysis and critical theory, among others. He is the author of the monograph entitled Hegel, Freud, and Fanon, The Dialectic of Emancipation, and co-editor of the recent volume entitled Hegel's Political Aesthetics, Art in Modern Society. He's also the author of numerous articles, of which I'll mention Hegel's Grounding of Intersubjectivity in the Master-Slave Dialectic, published in Philosophy and Social Criticism in 2012, and Constitutive Tension, a dialectical reading of intersectionality, published last year in Constellations. Today, Stefan will be giving a talk entitled Making Space for the Unconscious, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Freud. So this will be followed by comments from Alistair, and then a brief response from Stefan, after which we'll move to the Q&A. If you have any questions during this time, during the Q&A session, please just use the raise hand function in Zoom. Alternatively, you can use the chat function to let me know that you have a question. Or if need be, if you're having microphone problems or anything, you can just type your question in the chat directly, and then I'll read it out once we come to it. So we aim to end at 6:30 sharp, or more or less sharp, but we will leave the link open after this to continue at an informal level. Okay, so first up, please join me in welcoming Stefan Bird-Pollan.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you to Karen and Pavel for moderating, and for Alistair, I'm looking forward to the comments. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be able to give this paper. I was scheduled to come to Leuven, I guess, last spring, but of course things turned out otherwise. So I'm really pleased to be able to present this new work that I'm developing, and I'm looking forward to comments at the end. Thanks for coming. Okay, so the way I'll proceed, I think, is because it's too long of a paper to just read through, and also because that's a little bit boring. I will read the parts that I find need to be a little bit more finely formulated, and I will speak through some of the parts that I think are of more sort of larger scale systematic significance. So I'll read the introduction, then I think I'll sort of talk through the Schopenhauer part, and then I'll return to the Kant, and I'll have to do some more reading there to retain a bit of precision here in my thinking. If I could, I would talk through the whole thing, but I'm not quite in control of the material well enough to be able to do that. So you'll have to bear with me. Okay, so let me put on my reading glasses, and I'll use this as a teleprompter here to read for you a little bit. Okay, so this is the introduction. The post-Kantian world into which Freud stepped was characterized by two competing ambitions: philosophical systematicity and responsibility to the phenomenon. While the former was simply a philosophical inheritance, the latter, in its philosophically worked out form at least, was a product of Kant's Copernican turn and a programmatic claim that cognition could only be made sense of in terms of the conceptual scheme already in place. The compromise between the competing ambitions of responsibility to experience and systematicity found its articulation in the philosophical doctrine in which human finitude was acknowledged as the objective determination of mind itself. If everyone's conceptual scheme was limited in the same way, what would it matter that certain elements of mind were ruled out of epistemic practice and relegated to merely being thinkable? Science could proceed from a perspective of ordinary experience, which, nevertheless, has a universal foundation in the categories of the understanding. It is my contention that Freud's conception of the unconscious fits only uneasily into this post-Kantian world. By insisting that the phenomenon of the unconscious is given systematic import, Freud threatens to displace the primacy of consciousness needed not only for Kant's transcendental idealism, but also for positivism, since consciousness, on which the activity of science depends, must remain, even for positivism, the proper arbiter of nature. Kant's solution of making the world consciousness would be subject to revision if consciousness were not that for which nature ultimately is. But this thought is precisely what the unconscious threatens to undermine. It threatens to replace the unconscious consciousness as the I think with a deeper form of subjectivity in which consciousness and the unconscious struggle for control. Such a displacement would render science dubious, since it would then no longer be assumed judgments made by the conscious unconscious self about nature follow the logic of conscious the logic of the understanding. So, the Kantian background assumption. Let me formulate the Freudian challenge by first drawing out two aspects of the Kantian project. We can distinguish between two aspects of the Kantian project, the first being the general transcendental idealist position that experience must be for a subject. I take it that this position is shared by all post-Kantian thinkers, including positivists, in the sense that anyone who wishes to speak about a unified world must assume the experience can be unified for the observer. Call this the general Kantian position, which is that the claim made in the paragraph 16 of the B deduction that the I think must be capable of accompanying all of my representations. The second aspect is the more specific Kantian conception of the working of the understanding. The more specific view concerns the claim in paragraph 17 that the results of the so-called metaphysical deduction can be identified with the I think. Kant argues that the synthetic activity of the I must operate according to the logical forms of judgment, namely the categories. Yet by creating a relationship of mutual dependence between the I think as the conditions of experience per se and the systematic philosophical account of what would constitute the activity of the I, Kant at least implicitly countenances the possibility that his discovery of the particulars of mindedness could be revised on the basis of transcendental ego's inadequate grasp of the phenomenon of experience. Thus, Fichte and Hegel and all the rest adopt Kant's general picture, preferring to improve on the specific theory of the understanding and reason in order to restore to reason the authority ceded by Kant in response to rationalism and empiricism. So Schopenhauer will be a special case, and of course we'll discuss that later. Freud's challenge is unprecedented. For Freud must also, while Freud also accepts the general Kantian picture without which positivism as a science of experience would be impossible, he is the first to argue that the more specific picture of mind adopted by idealists is false on experiential grounds rather than on philosophical grounds. Freud is the first to offer a revision of the Kantian mindedness by focusing on the phenomenological incongruities within the operations of consciousness, which he diagnoses as evidence that mind is not coextensive with consciousness. Freud thinks of the difference between consciousness and the unconscious as systematic and gives this systematic division the name dynamic. These dynamic ideas have a certain character, he writes, that keep them apart. It's as separate forms of consciousness. And so there's the unconscious and the consciousness all within the general structure of the transcendental transcendental deduction, that is, of the general picture. The project of revising the picture of mind from the side of experience carries with it significant epistemic problems not faced by the project of the German idealists. For in revising the picture of mind, Freud has always to acknowledge that the very method of investigation depends on Kant's insight of the givenness experience to mind in the general sense, while insisting that what are regarded as, by Kant as contingent experiences of consciousness being disrupted by the unconscious carry systematic significance, which require a revision of Kant's theory of the understanding. Because everything we know about the unconscious appears within conscious mental life, Freud's revision must lean hard on the phenomenon of the incongruities of mental life, so as not to simply have them subsumed under more general finitude of consciousness, the way Kant conceives of it. Right. So the general idea is that the disruptions of consciousness coming from the unconscious are, under the general Kantian picture, just said, yeah, these are just the contingencies. Our focus goes in and out. You know, that's not where philosophy is. That's not what philosophy is really concerned with. But in order to provide the systematic difference between consciousness and unconsciousness, the unconscious, Freud has to make the phenomenon of that disruption into a philosophically relevant question. So that's the issue at stake here. So let me give a brief example taken from Jonathan Lear's discussion of Freud's famous case, the rat man, to make this a little clearer. Freud's obsessive patient, the rat man, noticing a stone on the road of his lady that his lady friend will travel on later that afternoon, removes it, only a few minutes later, to replace it. What is the phenomenon here? The phenomenon seems to be twofold, corresponding to the two perspectives we are trying to distinguish. On the more basic level, there's the experience of doing something and then doing something else. Both actions are fully intelligible as being performed by the rat man who relates the experience. The other experience, however, is of a different sort. The sort, in fact, that leads the rat man to Freud's couch. From picking up the stone and on second thought replacing it, the rat man experiences himself as not making sense to himself. That is, he experiences himself as not experiencing himself rightly, just as if something in him were making sense without making sense to him. It is this second phenomenon, the phenomenon of the interaction of consciousness and the unconscious within the generalized Kantian framework of the self, that is in need of explanation. This experience also makes clear why we must adhere to the general Kantian framework for the experience of this unity is only possible on the assumption of is the experience of. So I'm going to sort of skip over on this. I mean, Freud himself was never clear on exactly where he fell between, speculative psychology and empirical psychology. He always thought himself, of course, to be a positivist, but his sort of more metapsychological work really veers off into the highly speculative, right? So I think he saw himself caught between in some form of idealism and some form of positivism. And so part of this project, I think, is supposed to part of this project I'd like to have understood is making sense also of Freud's position, helping Freud to become clear about what exactly his position is. But I'm going to do that by sort of talking about a revision of Kant's own picture. Okay, so what I'd now like to talk about is Schopenhauer. I'd like to use Schopenhauer as a way of clarifying the particular issue that Freud faced, and sort of presenting, sort of getting us halfway to the correct revision of the Kantian picture. Okay, so Schopenhauer's position is unique in that he, more than any of his contemporaries, takes seriously the adversarial position of the will within the intellect, conceiving of the two as parallel, as correlated, rather than as seeing nature as ultimately subsumable under the intellect in the way that Fichte and Hegel do. The world, for Schopenhauer, is will and representation. The idea of mind and nature as merely correlated appears at least partially to be justified by Schopenhauer, not so much in philosophical systematic terms, rather by what he takes to be the experience of the world. What might be called Schopenhauer's phenomenology thus paves the way for Freud's own insistence that experience be given systematic importance. Schopenhauer's appeal to experience can be seen throughout the text of the world as will and representation, which includes a meditation on such topics as mental illness, sexuality, emotion, genius, art, right? All those wonderful topics that make up books 3 and 4 of both volumes of the text. In what follows, I first sketch Schopenhauer's beginnings in transcendental idealism as responding to the problem of the representational nature of the world, focusing on the workings of intellect. Then I shall sketch briefly Freud's theory of the, Schopenhauer's theory of the will and the way it veers into naturalism antagonistic to the idealist project. Okay. So I should just note also here, I'm not following sort of influences. Right? I think there's a whole literature about Schopenhauer as the precursor of Freud's thinking about the unconscious. This literature is well developed and it's interesting, but it's not the topic, because what's really the issue for me here is whether they are even, whether Schopenhauer's conception of the will is sort of conceptually compatible with what I will ultimately say the unconscious is, right? So we can't compare a realist conception of the unconscious to an anti-realist or idealist conception of the unconscious, right? That's comparing apples and oranges. So let me say a couple words then about Schopenhauer. Okay, I think we're doing all right on time here. Okay, so I think the thing to focus on here in Schopenhauer is really the interesting sort of innovation that Schopenhauer brings. What Schopenhauer does is he follows the representational picture of Kant, explaining that, of course, we don't see the world, the intellect does not see the world the way it really is, does not understand the world as it is in itself, but there's a representational picture here that he follows Kant. But what Schopenhauer then does is he turns away from that picture in an interesting way by insisting that we have access to ourselves through an immediacy which is not mediated through the intellect. Right, and that's really the important move that Schopenhauer makes. So let me focus on that. If the world as appearance is to be correlated to the world of reality, how does the correlation between mind and body come about? For Schopenhauer, contact between mind and nature occurs through immediate experience of the body. The self's immediate experience of the body is conceived in different terms than the intellect's relation to the body, which is representational. Schopenhauer writes that the body is given in two distinct ways: as object among other representations and as will. Because reality is immediately given as will and only mediatedly through the intellect, as object, Schopenhauer concludes that the will is primary in that the intellect is secondary. The latter is related to form as accident is related to substance. The will is the essential, the eigentlich nature of reality, while the intellect is just a tool of the will. Accordingly, the self-consciousness is merely the grasping of the will by the intellect as that which animates it. This suggests a picture of the I in self-consciousness as standing beside or only in relation to its other self of consciousness, only really able to observe its own workings. Even so, we must think of will and intellect as united by some sort of general self for the distinction even to make sense, that this has to be an experiential totality in some way, which I'm saying contains the correlation between will and intellect. Okay. Okay, so Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will does suggest not just a metaphysical correlation between mind and nature, but also a certain priority of will over the intellect, not unlike the unconscious's or the id's priority over the ego. And I think it's most useful to think of this priority as seeking to accommodate the fact of the intellect's relative impotence with regard to the emotion and non-cognitive, or what is sometimes described as the irrationality within an overall philosophical framework, right? So I guess and so Schopenhauer, what I want to say is that brings into the Kantian system the priority of experience. And what that means is that he's abstracting, he's looking at experience and saying, look, experience doesn't match up with this, with the dominance of the intellect, the way Kant conceives of it, right? And so Schopenhauer is importing his naturalism into the German idealist framework But since that can't be imported without unproblematically, Schopenhauer leaves them standing there as correlated, right? And his evidence for that is a certain kind of appeal to just sort of brute experience, right? This is what turned Schopenhauer's philosophy into a some call it Lebensphilosophie, right? Sort of a philosophy of life, which is based more on the experiential side than on the philosophical, systematic side. Okay, so that's the side on the theoretical, and now I'd like to talk briefly about the limits of this program when we're talking about the practical and about the psychoanalytic. Okay, so practical philosophy and pessimism in Schopenhauer. The correlation between the transcendentally ideal and the naturalistic metaphysics has so far been interpreted as an investigation into how mind is not just affected, but necessarily structured by the nature it encounters. Treating the discovery of the will in this way means treating Schopenhauer as seeking, at the minimum, to replace the particular conception of mind in Kant to bring it more in line with the experience of nature. The supreme authority of the I think has been subordinated to the will, but conceptuality, the other side of the correlation, can be maintained. However, this is not the case on the practical side. As is clear from remarks scattered throughout the world as will and representation concerning morality, the practical side of Schopenhauer's philosophy is also meant as a phenomenology of moral experience. For the discovery of the will behind the intellect constitutes a critique of traditional morality, as well as of Kant's positive conception of freedom. Schopenhauer seeks to replace this standard conception of morality with an ethics of sympathy, particularly in Book 4, where he characterizes the human intellect as essentially subordinate and hence unfree with regard to the will. The difference between the theoretical and the practical lies in the asymmetry between mind and nature, how mind and nature relate in these two spheres. Exploring this difference will reveal why Schopenhauer's discovery of the will can ultimately not provide an adequate conception of the Freudian unconscious. We've been treating the relation between the intellect as merely representational, representing the world, and the naturalistic truth of the will qua immediate as correlated. The correlated view allows the activities of the intellect to be conceived of as remaining at least partially independent of the will. This gap is what the doctrine of the genius will make use of. For on strict epistemic grounds, it makes no difference to the intellect what constitutes the nature it is responding to. Nature can come from the outside or from the inside, right? Either from material nature or from the will. It's all the same to the intellect. But things are different on the practical level. For here, the conception of the I or intellect as subservient to the will means that the I is no longer free in any meaningful sense. The standard of freedom, since Kant, as Schopenhauer well knew, is the ability of the I to be the source of its own actions. In a practical realm, there can be no relative autonomy the way there can be in the theoretical world. In the practical world, the I is either autonomous or it is heteronymous. And this means that Schopenhauer's naturalism of the will must either be fully embraced or fully rejected in the practical sphere. If it is fully embraced, the idea of freedom in a robust Kantian sense becomes impossible. If it is rejected, the practical is subsumed under the theoretical and becomes meaningless. So Schopenhauer's transfer of the concept of freedom to the will is fundamentally meaningless. The I is either free or it isn't. The will's freedom is, from the perspective of the I, simply the freedom of another. The rupture of the delicate theoretical relationship between the intellect and the will in the practical realm has consequences for the theoretical realm as well. I've just suggested that in the practical realm, there can be only one authority, and it is either the will or the practical or free intellect. But once the practically free intellect has been denied, the phenomena of nature, which have been, after all, the reason for Schopenhauer's division of the world into will and representation, look quite different. For the theoretical problem of knowledge, we saw diagnosed in book 2 as reducible to the will, has an unavoidable practical component, as can be seen in the insight that the will, as groundless, does not want anything, has no goal. Yet what is knowledge for it? What is knowledge for if it is not to inform action of the striving of the will? The theoretical knowledge of practical motives for action is ultimately groundless, since the will has no practical motives. Okay, so thinking back to the rat man, the phenomenon which we sought to understand now takes on a new meaning. Recall the two aspects of the overall problem. The general Kantian view of the two distinct actions of picking up the stone and replacing it, which were intelligible each by themselves, and the sense of the two actions as somehow experientially connected in a way that could not be made sense of, and is therefore understood to be orchestrated by another. The point to appreciate is that by giving the unrecognizable will the ultimate causal authority of practical life, Schopenhauer has made the rat man's experience of his actions intrinsically unintelligible to him. Will or unconscious is the source of action, yet remains intrinsically separate from the intellect. So this picture is what Schopenhauer's view of pessimism is, what produces Schopenhauer's view of pessimism. The will is grasped as a blind will to life which operates within us. The will to life, sui generis, is capable of no further explanation. Schopenhauer likens us to a mole who works tirelessly underground but remains surrounded by darkness. This forces us to concede, Schopenhauer argues, that life is a business whose profit does not cover its expenses. Schopenhauer's philosophy here becomes a Lebensphilosophie, and no longer a critical tool through which to understand ourselves as practical beings. Okay, so mindful of the time, let me just end here by saying that the issue, the reason we should worry about the practical implications for Schopenhauer in Schopenhauer's conception of the will is because, of course, we're comparing them to Freud's conception of the unconscious. And Freud's conception of the unconscious will necessarily have to do with the practical, in a sense that psychoanalytic therapy is about changing actions, changing patterns of behavior. And so we can't just let it rest at the theoretical level. If the unconscious is not something whose motives we can ascertain, right, then psychoanalysis as a cure will become impossible. And so I think that's the limit of Schopenhauer's Schopenhauer's usefulness to this picture. So what I want to take from Schopenhauer is the important insight that nature is more than Kant thought it was. But I want to say that insight remains inert, practically speaking, because it can't lead us to anything like therapeutic intervention in the psychoanalytic perspective. Okay, so with that, I want to now move back to Kant and see what else we've got here. Okay. All right. So Kant's two types of thinking. This is sort of the final section, longer final section. Okay, before proceeding, let us review the arguments so far. We began with the claim that nature must always be for a subject in some general sense. This claim made it possible to argue against the more particular claim, a Kantian claim, that consciousness extends over all of nature on the experiential grounds that consciousness only grasps nature partially. The question arose as to whether this partial grasping of nature by consciousness is merely contingent, right, as the Kantian view has it, or whether the partial grasping of nature needs to be investigated structurally. That's Freud's view, right, and also Schopenhauer's view. Okay. Okay, so perhaps we can accept Schopenhauer's criticism of the Kantian view, but not his particular solution. Okay. Good. So let me get into the issue here. So in the years following the publication of the first critique, it must have become apparent to Kant that he had conceived of nature too narrowly. There were other sorts of experiences which are either reducible to cognition, which were neither reducible to cognition of the understanding, nor are the mere fancy of reason untethered from sensibility. This led to the theorizing of the aesthetic as a cooperation between different faculties in a non-standard way. The cooperation between imagination and intuition gives us beauty. Cooperation between reason and intuition gives us the sublime. But Kant also noticed that the objectivity of cognition comes from Kant notices also that the objectivity of cognition coming from the understanding is limited in an unacceptable way. For on the theory proposed by the first critique, science is nothing but the piecemeal accumulation of different judgments about nature, and not the system of nature which natural science presupposes and in certain senses relies upon. Because only individual parts of nature are cognized, there is nothing guaranteeing that there are not in fact huge gaps in our knowledge, or even huge areas of knowledge which we have not yet even begun to consider. What Kant discovers, in other words, is that while individual cognitions are justified as objective relations in themselves, their relative connection to each other in the larger framework remains open. So the individual acts of picking up and replacing the stone are intelligible in their own right, but not necessarily as a pair of connected actions. Kant comes to the realization that the fundamental relational category through which we connect different acts in the world, that is causality, is inadequate. So the two stone activity could be causally related, but can never be shown to be so for the rat man. The problem for Kant is that the causal view of the world is merely mechanical, which means that it only ever constructs hypothetical connections of possibility, and can never get to actual connections between elements. What we as humans seem to crave, and according to the Kantian picture, have no authority to claim objectively, is something more, a final purpose which connects the different elements in the world as delivered to us by our many cognitions in a complete context. Given the results of the first critique, according to which only that can count as cognition which has its origins in receptivity or experience, any speculation about final purposes will have to remain just that. However, Kant argues, judgments of final purpose should be permitted to the extent that they are understood to proceed in analogy to regular cognitions. For the analogy allows us at least to think the connections between different cognitions, which cannot be unified by the work of the understanding. This new form of judgment of final purpose is based on an entirely new faculty of judgment. The faculty of judgment operates only reflectively and concerns what is pleasurable and displeasurable. Its principle is purposiveness. The revised picture here has direct relevance to the rat man's problem. First of all, there is the general intelligibility of the two actions as standing in relation to one another. Call this the general thinkability aspect, the general Kantian insight that experience, however diverse, must be located in a single subject which unifies it, right? So for which the experience is. The second aspect of this picture is of the familiar individual actions of the rat man takes, call them determinative judgment, the form of judgment basic to the specifications of the first critique model. However, the third and new aspect of judgment concerns the relationship between the two actions. However, in acknowledgement of the fundamental inscrutability of nature, new reflective judgment concerns only the hypothetical and not the specific or determinate relationship between the two. Reflective judgments only frame determinative judgments. They offer a view as if from the perspective of God, Kant says. Their basis is deeper and hence more vague than determinative judgment, giving only a feeling of purpose, purposiveness, right, without offering a determinate purpose. Okay. All right, so now I'd like the section is called the double logic of thinking. Having outlined how Kant's revised picture of nature might fit with the model of the unconscious seen in the rat man, it is now time to suggest some more detailed connections between the unconscious and Kant's theory of judgment. Making these connections will require modifying some of Kant's assumptions. Kant's transcendental view of experience seeks the conditions for the possibility of experience. Thus, Kant's theory of judgment sketches two possible modes of theoretical judgment, which can be distinguished in principle. However, since the experience of the relation between consciousness and the unconscious cannot be a priori, right, the experiential, normal person view, right, such experiences must fall somewhere between those two possible modes of judgment and actually exist on the continuum between the two. If we admit of this modest modification of Kant's perspective, we can understand the subject in general as always operating on the continuum of the two perspectives. This means thinking of the human subject as existing on the continuum between the very general, right, emotional, barely unified on the one hand, and the highly analytic, highly unified, and extremely rational on the other side. And since the subject is constituted by a series of judgments, the subject will over time exist at different locations within this continuum. As I wake up, my perspective will be of a more general sort, being attracted by the smell of coffee, say. As I wake, I seek to pull myself together, engage in judgments of a more analytic kind as I seek to write a few pages before drifting back to a lower level of unity, we can say, after having a large lunch, for instance, right? These are phenomenologically, I think, available experiences that that sort of shift us between various levels of taking in the world. The different levels of judgment represent different levels of separation from nature. Sort of the highly analytic takes us very far outside of nature. The more reflective takes us sort of closer into nature. Our experiences are sort of a more unified type. Okay, so what about the question of disruption that is an issue here? As on a continuum, right, the self constitutes itself qua rational actor who judges the world in terms of the categories of the understanding. But these categories are, let me start again. Okay. As the continuum suggests, the self-constitution of the subject qua rational actor who judges the world in terms of the categories of the understanding is only ever a temporary phenomenon. The other thing to see is that between the different moments of pulling themselves together into an analytic judger, the subject remains relatively unorganized. But since the relative disorganization is not of a determinate kind, this means that the subject will in some ways be different when they pull themselves together in one moment than when they pull themselves together at a previous moment. From the perspective of the rational actor, however, these dips, which seem to alter the subject, will be experienced as disruptions. This occurs, for instance, when one changes one's mind, something that can occur in quick succession. The change may well be felt as an embarrassment by the subject, a sign that they do not know their own mind, right? This is the experience of making a quick judgment, and then sort of being thrown back on that and saying, wait, no, that's actually not how I feel. I feel the other way. I'm going to make this other judgment, right? That constitutes, and so depending on your sort of personality, I guess you could be embarrassed about that and find this as disruptive, or you can say, well, that's just how I am. Okay, so let's return to the rat man's problem. The rat man experiences his change of mind with regard to the stone as more than an embarrassing change of mind. For the rat man is an obsessive, which means that he falsely believes that only the highly analytic mode of determinative judgment is an acceptable and proper mode of subjectivity. This is a mode of, but yet this is a mode of defense against a certain disunity he feels in himself. Because he fetishizes rational judgment as the only mode of subjectivity, the lack of the highly rational level of unity between the two judgments is experienced not only embarrassing, but is existentially threatening. Okay, so the chance of a cure stems precisely from the fact, however, that the rat man can experience both the disruption as a disruption for him. Right? This makes it possible to think about being released in some sense from the pathology of thinking of oneself as always requiring to engage at this highest level of judgment. If the rat man can relax a little bit, cannot think of his subjectivity as bound up only in determinative judgment, then maybe more of his life will become intelligible to him. So that's what I'd like to suggest. Okay, now let me move on to the conclusion here, mindful of the time. So some final remarks on Freud. The conceptual space I have tried to open up for the unconscious draws on Schopenhauer and Kant in the following way. From Schopenhauer, I took the powerful suggestion that the Kantian picture from the first critique is flawed, in that it does not recognize that human-mindedness is driven by a powerful force which cannot simply be subsumed by the work of the understanding, right, as in determinative judgment. I argue that Schopenhauer also tries to preserve the general picture of transcendental idealism as a responsiveness to the overarching unity of thought necessary to experience. Yet, as Kant makes clear, the interruption of the I, or the intellect by the will, so central to Schopenhauer, only makes sense if the interruption is grasped as an interruption, which means that the interruption must be intelligible in terms of the overall paradigm of meaning which it interrupts. The way to think about this, I argued, is to understand interruption as the result of a temporary incompatibility of two different ways of thinking about nature. I suggested that this relation between could be made philosophically intelligible using the distinction between reflective and determinative judgment. In Freudian terms, this relation may be put by saying that the unconscious exists alongside the ego, both of which topographically exist within the self. In what remains of this paper, let me substantiate the model just developed with reference to some elements of Kant's theory, Freud's theory. As we do so, it should be remembered that Freud worked within three different models of the mind: the energetic model, the economic model, and the dynamic model, only last of which we can consider here. The other models lead to different conceptions of the unconscious. The concept of repression, which we can't go into here, is centrally concerned with the energy model, since it concerns the blocking and escaping of psychic energy coming from the unconscious into the ego for purposes of action. Okay, so the dynamic level for Freud concerns the tension between two different types of thinking or judging nature. In analogy to Kant's distinction between reflective judgment and determinative judgment, Freud conceptualizes the difference in the uptake of nature as either taking place through the primary or the secondary process. These are famously outlined in the interpretation of dreams. The feature of the primary process may be characterized as different ways of judging particulars, that is, as characterized by a certain logic of subsumption. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud distinguishes 5 operations of the logic of the unconscious: displacement, condensation, timelessness, the absence of negation, and the substitution of intrapsychic content for extrapsychic content. The features of the secondary process are those of standard formal logic, or what Kant would call transcendental logic, I suppose. Yet while it is standard practice to interpret the difference between these two processes in the same way Kant's distinction between the reflective and determinative judgment is interpreted, this is a mistake. The two processes are only analytically distinct, not empirically distinct. They exist on a continuum within our general transcendental consciousness, within the general sort of foreness of the world for us, right? And for Freud, this also includes dreams, because we are, of course, at some level conscious of our dreams, right? We experience them, we wake up from them, are conscious of that material in conscious life. The importance of understanding these two analytically distinct systems as existing on the continuum comes from the experience of the unconscious itself. For the experiencing subject is always constituted by a cooperation or tension between the unconscious and consciousness. There are 2 ways of understanding this interaction: epistemically and logically. Epistemically speaking, the Kantian and the Freudian model of the relation between the two processes or judgments line up fairly well. For Kant, as for Freud, the primary process and reflective judgment function as the first and most basic interface with nature, in the sense they both produce a whole around which the ego or the I think constitute themselves. Thus, determinative judgment and the secondary process are always framed by what is delivered to them by reflective judgment and the primary process. At the empirical level, the deliverances from reflective judgment or the primary process make determinative judgment and the secondary process liable to distortion. For Kant, this is primarily the problem of mistaking the possible for the actual, as he says in paragraph 76 of the third critique. For Freud, the situation is again similar, since consciousness's dependence on the primary process means that that we forever live in a partially fantastical and hallucinated world. From Kant's transcendental perspective, this continuum between reflective and determinative judgment is understood merely as a contingency of human experience, a feature of the messiness of subjectivity. The devaluation of certain features of experience as contingent is the result of the bargain struck by Kant's transcendental project. Kant's philosophy famously pronounces itself uninterested in error because error is a feature of finite sensory apparatus. Right? Kant's philosophy is a philosophy of truth which exists at the level of conceptuality. Kant is also uninterested in the source of dogmatic operation, is uninterested in the sources of dogmatic operation of reason leading to metaphysics, and only offers a critique of the, quote, natural and unavoidable illusion, end quote. Okay. And yet, the interaction between the two types of judgment distinguished by Kant is itself a phenomenon of nature, which might be given a transcendental analysis. Let me illustrate this point here finally with recourse to the conception of the unconscious by the psychoanalyst Ignacio Mate Blanco. Mate Blanco argues that the logic of the primary process is not a separate logic from the logic of the secondary process, since all synthesis of particulars into objects necessary to take place in consciousness, conceived even at the most general level of the I think. This means that there's really only a single logic which operates at different levels of psychic life. The primary process is simply the way, at the most basic or general level of mindedness, objects are constituted. Hence, objects are barely differentiated in the manner of the philosophical concept of being or God, or in the psychoanalytic concept of the mother's breast for the infant, right? So that the most basic level, there's just being or there's the mother's breast, right? And we don't distinguish much there. Right? As we ascend from the most general to the more particular, different types of judgments operate alongside each other. Thus, the process of condensation, for instance, operates by reflectively constituting a totality out of disparate intuitions and memories, right? Disparate intuitions, but also treats those intuitions as determinatively constituting a particular person, right? So there's a totality which is nonetheless unified as a particular object, and we can speak of it in terms of both the sort of the generalness and also the determinateness. The problem of disruption, which we have seen play such an important role in Freud's account. Okay, I'm going to skip this a little bit. Let me just skip to the conclusion because I think the point is clear. So what I'm suggesting is that Freud's discovery of the unconscious is not the discovery of human irrationality, but an extension of the logic of human thought into the realm that Kant did not conceive of as relevant to philosophy. What I've sketched here is thus meant as a friendly amendment to Kant's particular view of the workings of the understanding. But the amendment is also meant to acknowledge the correctness of Kant's conception of mind as not fully graspable in conceptual terms, right? And here I also agree with Schopenhauer, and is therefore meant to bolster the Kantian position against those of his successors who thought that nature could be fully subsumed under concepts. And of course, that's Hegel on a certain reading, not on another reading. Anyway, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So we're going to hear now from Alistair Welchman. Alistair is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Texas, San Antonio. His research interests include French philosophy, especially Gilles Deleuze, modern or classical German philosophy, in particular Kant, Maimon, Schopenhauer, and Schelling. He is the co-translator of The World as Will and Representation from Schopenhauer, and the author of numerous articles, including Schopenhauer's Understanding of Schelling, published in the Oxford Handbook of Schopenhauer in 2020, or The Concept of Eternity in Kant and Post-Kantian European Thought, which is published in the volume Eternity in 2016. So please join me in welcoming Alistair.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Karen and to Powell and to Stefan for organizing this. I really enjoyed your paper, Stefan. I'm going to refer to you as Stefan, if that's okay. It feels weird to call you Bird-Pollan in a situation like this. I'm going to start by, I'm not going to read, I'm going to just try and talk for a couple of minutes, but I'm going to start by appreciating rather than criticizing. So I really do think that this is a super interesting project. So in once, I'm going to say what I think is going on because that's going to influence what my comments are. Of course, I may be wrong about that. But it seems to me, right, it's pretty clear your basic project here is to understand Freud's extension of psychic processes from the well-known secondary processes into this more general conception of primary processes. You want to understand that through Kant's extension of the theory of judgment from the exclusively determinant judgment, determining judgments in the first critique, to this more nuanced account of, I like the way you put it right now, which was an extension to the paper that I saw, but of a continuum of judgments rather than a dichotomy, a continuum of judgments between relatively more determinative and then more reflective judgments. So one advantage of this proposal is that it respects what you call the phenomenological aspect of psychoanalysis. And I think that's, there are some critical things to say, but I think that's basically an important point to make. It is one, I think it should be acknowledged that will annoy people who come from the psychoanalytic tradition, especially people who are more psychoanalytic than philosophers. So it's a somewhat provocative term, but I think it is fundamentally a sensible one, and I think it's important to defend this kind of interpretation of psychoanalysis. Here's a consideration in favor that you allude to. The unconscious would remain completely unknown if it didn't have some trace on consciousness. And both the theoretical practice of psychoanalysis and the theoretical postulation of the unconscious would remain ungrounded in that situation. So it seems reasonable to suggest if the unconscious has leaves traces in the conscious, that there is something like a phenomenology of the unconscious. And of course, the term symptom there, right, really gathers together what one might understand. So in the Ratman case, that's the only reading I did, apart from reading Stefan's paper, the only reading I did was to reread the Ratman case. And in the Ratman case, yeah, he experiences a symptom of a kind of, it's unclear whether it's an excess or deficit of meaning, but there's some, he experiences a problem. I think Stefan puts it pretty clearly. Each of in the one case of the two stones, right, where taking the stone up and then putting it back again in this kind of pathological way. He experiences himself as the author of each of those individual actions, but can't understand the sequence of them, can't understand the relation between them. But that lack of understanding isn't blank, it's a positive experience. And that's the symptom. And that's, in a sense, where a kind of philosophical approach to psychoanalysis might start. So I think that's super interesting. Schopenhauer is the, there's a lot of work that Stefan has alluded to about the historical influence of Schopenhauer's conception of the will on Freud. Freud himself talks about Schopenhauer in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, famously describes a moment of speculation as having steered into the safe harbor of Schopenhauer's philosophy. And again, Stefan emphasizes a somewhat unusual aspect of Schopenhauer, which is its phenomenological aspect. And that is again a minority opinion, I think, in Schopenhauer reception. But there are some people who work on that, especially in the French tradition. Michel Henry comes to mind, and more recently Barbara Stiegler, who have emphasized that phenomenological aspect. And I think that's I affirm that as a way to go with Schopenhauer too. Ultimately, Stefan likes the picture of the will as primary to representation, as dominating representation, because that matches Freud's distinction between the dominance of the primary process over the secondary process, and there are various other kind of more technical ways in which Stefan in the longer paper talks about the intersection between will and unconscious. But ultimately, Stefan finds Schopenhauer's view wanting. It seems to me largely because of practical considerations, and those are themselves largely oriented around our impotence in relation, the impotence of the intellect in relation to the will, which manifests itself in Schopenhauer's embrace of causal determinism, or a form of causal determinism, and in his embrace of pessimism, right? There's just nothing we can do. Another point that I thought was really quite well judged was that there is a sense in which the metaphysical exteriority of the will creates the same problems as the naturalistic exteriority of the unconscious does in those naturalizing scientific causal third personal accounts of the unconscious that Stefan criticizes. And that's an interesting view because, of course, Schopenhauer's the metaphysical view of the will is not directly enmeshed in that naturalism, but maybe there is a parallel. The exteriority of the will, the metaphysical exteriority, matches in some way the causal exteriority, and that violates this phenomenological approach because we can't get an understanding from purely third personal point of view. And then the solution that Stefan proposes is a return to Kant rather than an exacerbation of the kind of tendencies that were present in Schopenhauer's philosophy, but a return to Kant that promises an understanding of the unconscious that avoids this kind of exteriority and can be faithful to the phenomenology of the symptom. And there are that orients itself around this distinction or continuum between determinant and reflective judgments. And I found several reasons why that's a positive view, which are reasons to think that that's a good way of thinking. One is that reflective judgments are clearly integrated into the phenomenological unity of the person, so they're not in this problematic relation of exteriority, either causal or metaphysical. I liked the idea that the problematic that Kant introduces in the original introduction to the third critique, this problematic of the systematicity of experience. I like the fact that addresses the distinction between levels in the Ratman's self-understanding, that he has maybe access to a kind of understanding that he's the author of the individual act of putting the stone, of taking the stone away and putting it back, but that the systematic relation of those is lacking, and so one needs another form of judgment to understand that. The reflective judgment preserves some features of primary process, maintains a fundamental relationship to affect, pain and pleasure, and the faculty of desire. And the indeterminacy of reflective judgment, or according to one slogan, right, in determinate judgment, the universal is given and we subsume the particular underneath it, and in reflective judgment, the particular is given and we must search somehow for the universal. That indeterminacy suggests the possibility of accounting for other really crucial and fundamental features of the unconscious, like ambivalence, right? So that ambivalence is the subsumption, possibility of subsuming something, an individual experience, under two possible categories. So I think that's really a super interesting project. Maybe I can make two brief points about it. One, I kind of hate myself for doing this, but I feel like I must defend Schopenhauer. That's not always the right thing to do. But I do think there are more resources in Schopenhauer for thinking about the independence of the intellect from the will than you give him credit for. And it occurred to me while you were speaking that one of the reasons why those might not have been apparent is that a lot of the work on moral philosophy Schopenhauer doesn't do in the world as will and representation. And in fact, in many ways, the world as will and representation is barely even consistent with those later views. He always says it is, but barely even consistent. But certainly they give a somewhat different picture. I'm thinking of the prize essays on morality. So one thing one aspect of that where Schopenhauer maybe I think does have something more to say is that he really is concerned, despite his causal determinism, with the question of how we can be the authors of our actions. That's a problematic for him, and he doesn't want to just dismiss that. The causal determinism leads into a slightly weird place, but it is the same place Schelling was, and it's related to Kant. And that is the idea that although I could not have done otherwise, because I'm causally determined by the interaction of events and my character, I'm still responsible. There is still a sense in which I'm the author of my action, because Schopenhauer says I could have chosen at a transcendental level to have been another kind of person. So I'm responsible for the kind of person that I am, right? Even though there's now nothing that I can do about it. And that view, it does lead to some independence of the intellect, because I don't know what my character is. I only get to know what my character is, not primarily through introspection, which is a terrible guide, but rather through looking at what I've done. When I look at what I've done, I'm responsible for those things, even though I disavow them. And there is a process which is parallels or leaves space for a kind of a therapeutic process by means of which I come to understand more about what I am and assimilate what had seemed to me disavowed or alien parts of me. I assimilate those. And those processes seem like avatars of the Freudian process. And then the second point I want to make, I can see that I'm over time, so I'll keep this one narrow. It's actually related to the first one. So I think the inference that you make from the general question about the epistemic accessibility of the unconscious, that if it doesn't leave traces in the conscious, what are we to say? It must leave traces in the conscious. You make an inference from that, which seems plausible, to the conclusion that there must, and I tacitly, I feel an always or a necessarily, especially in the context of your interest in Kant, there must always or necessarily be a phenomenological response to the unconscious. There must always be a phenomenological registration. And I don't think that's a valid argument. I think the premise could be true and the conclusion false. And here's a couple of considerations to think about. One thing that is big in my mind right now, because I'm working on it, is thinking about the Freudian unconscious in relation to phenomena like implicit bias. Now, in cases like that, the operation of the unconscious, insofar as it's interpolating us into oppressive structures, is most effective when it has no phenomenological registration, right? Someone says something racist, and you call them on it, and they're like, that's not racist, right? The denial can be really, I mean, sincere. I assume, I mean, I don't have access to their minds, but I assume it could be completely sincere. And so it seems plausible to think that in that case, the operation of the unconscious can be completely without phenomenological registration. And maybe that's an unusual case. But it seems like there are lots of other cases. I was thinking more generally, there are lots of other cases, and this relates to the picture that Schopenhauer gives, where the experience that I have of of having a symptom is an interplay between phenomenological and third personal experience, right? It's not all given phenomenologically. Because one, I think Schopenhauer is right. One of the ways in which we come to understand ourselves more is by seeing ourselves as someone else sees us. We see ourselves in the third person. We look at that, we're like, oh my God, did I do that? And we want to disavow it. And Schopenhauer is like, no, you can't disavow it. You freaking did it. And a broadly kind of psychoanalytic approach involves a kind of delicate interplay between those first personal and third personal ascriptions, right? We might be tempted to disavow in the first instance, but after a while, we can come to see that third personal ascription, right, which we're alienated from, is in fact something that we have to come to accept. And that seems to be it violates the stricture of phenomenology, that phenomenology is essentially first personal. So there is, I have to adopt a third personal perspective sometimes in order to decode or read the symptoms. And I'm going to make one last point. I'm sorry, one last point. This is very undeveloped. And that is just that in the written version of the paper that you gave, you talked very briefly about Leibniz. That's fine. We don't have to talk about Leibniz. But you didn't like the Leibnizian theory of the petite perception. Rightly, I think. It's not an avatar of the unconscious. Why? Well, because the little perceptions they correspond much more closely to what Freud would call the pre-conscious, right? That is to say, they're just things that could have been conscious in principle. They were just too small, or our sense organs or whatever weren't delicate enough to read them. And I think that's right. But what worries me about the use of a continuum between reflective judgment and determinate judgment as a way of understanding the distinction between primary and secondary process is that I'm having a hard time seeing how your view is not also going to be a view of the unconscious as specifically pre-conscious. And I was particularly interested to note in the paper that you just read that you specifically focus on the non-energetic Freudian theory. And it sounded like that means that you're prepared to abandon the theory of repression. But if you abandon the theory of repression, it seems like you don't have access to what's specific about that Freudian unconscious, and you will have an unconscious that looks much more like the pre-conscious. Anyway, super good job. I really enjoyed that. I think it's original. I don't think anyone else is working on that, although I'm not an expert in the Freud stuff. And I think it's a super idea.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much for that. It looks like I will have a long list of questions, but so we have a little bit of time. Stefan, if you want to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. Thank you for all of this. Just the last thing, because I think it's the most sort of generally in people's minds. Yes, I mean, repression, of course, is an issue. I do not want to abandon repression, and I think repression is something that needs to be explored in things like unconscious bias, which actually one of my papers, I think even Pavel mentioned, is about. But that is seen from a different perspective, right? And so what I was trying to work out is the dynamic aspect. Now I have not worked out how the dynamic and the energetic are going to coincide. But if the project becomes more than the paper, it will definitely have to be dealt with somehow. So I do not wish to abandon the repression. However, I do want to say, following Mate Blanco, that repression is not the key phenomenon of the unconscious. Repression is something that it happens, but many things sort of just follow back and forth. The unconscious interrupts us. It doesn't necessarily have to be repressed to interrupt us, right? We switch between these different levels of these different operations of consciousness, of conscious unconsciousness, and those carry us back and forth, between these more basic thoughts and these more analytic thoughts. And just the variation between those is sufficient to explain a lot of mental life. Now, there are special instances of that, I don't want to say, of course, which do have to do with repression. And of course, Freud thought of the unconscious as mainly the repressed unconscious. The model I'm working with suggests that that is not the central problem of mental life. Of course, this is a way which psychoanalysis, of course, deals with psychopathology in the way that philosophy doesn't. Right? So philosophers are more concerned with sort of general mental life, general mental structures, and so that was the direction I was going in, and that was where the dynamic conception of the unconscious, I thought, could more easily be located. So yeah.
Okay, questions from the audience. Manya.
Yes, thank you for your interesting paper. I would maybe like to ask something about a connection. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, between reflecting judgment and immediate experience. So I think that you were talking in connection to Schopenhauer about immediate experience and immediacy, and that this could be correlated to Freud's notion of unconsciousness. So something as a striving of the will and so on. And then with reflective judgment of Kant, I have a bit of problems. Isn't this reflecting judgment in a way a very distant, metaphorical, but at the same time very distant judgment? I mean, you mentioned, for instance, that reflecting judgment goes more into nature or something like this. But of course, this is done from outside, from some outside perspective. And when we speak about immediate experience or striving of the will, it seems to be something more connected with feelings, with some different perspective than this hypothetical regulative judgment of Kant does. So this might be my question: how can we understand this correlation? And then maybe a comment. I think that a small suggestion. I think that you were mentioning like this way from Kant to Schopenhauer, or maybe what Schopenhauer took from Kant. And then, but he then focused on the primacy of the will and the body and so on. But maybe my interpretation or comment would be that also in German idealism, there are already some directions that go into this. I mean, that also point out maybe this will as some primacy of the will, but then also the connection with the body. I mean, in Fichte, this two aspect view, I think in the vocation of man, for instance, is very strong. So I would like to see the development from Kant through German idealism to Schopenhauer and then further away as a more linear in a way. Of course, there are also small differences, but it's not so much that just Schopenhauer just took something from Kant, but there are also Fichte or Alistair mentioned before, Schelling and so on, that already somehow mention similar aspects that then we can find also in Schopenhauer and then maybe later in Freud. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'll take the first question. I think the second question, that is true. I mean, I know that takes us maybe a little bit too far. Yes, I mean, there seem to be two conceptions of what the faculty of judgment is doing in Kant, right? I think the immediacy aspect I'm taking from Kant's claim that the faculty of judgment concerns itself with what is pleasurable and displeasurable, and that seems to me a more basic interface with the world than the than determinative judgment, than the other two faculties. So I'm channeling that, but of course you're right. When Kant is talking about the activities of science, of course he's thinking of reflective judgment as a sort of stepping back. And I think these are two sides of Kant's conception of reflective judgment that are not really unified in his system, but there seem to be sort of there's sort of a genetic model that is where experience comes from, and there I think there's a connection between the faculty of judgment, schematization, the imagination, and then finally determinative judgment, the understanding. So that's and then there's sort of a structural feature where you're right. I think Kant thinks of reflective judgment as sort of standing outside as a perspective on these, as a unifying perspective. And I was just sort of I went with one because it seemed better for the analogy. So
Okay, next on my list is helping Lou Adler.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a question for Stefan. I really enjoyed the talk. Very interesting. I was a little bit puzzled by something you said toward the end of your talk. You said Kant's philosophy is famously not interested in error. And there you seem to be contrasting error with truth. But I'm puzzled in the sense that I actually would think that the Kant's conception of error is directly relevant to your project. Because, for one, Kant's epigraph to the very second edition of the First Critique was a reference to ending error, right? It's a reference to Bacon's project of ending error. So Kant obviously is very interested in error, and he said a great deal about error in the logic lectures. Now let me say a little bit about why I think it's directly relevant to your project, which is actually has to do with the remark you just said about reflection. So the kind of reflection you're talking about, like the stepping back and just to kind of take a kind of broader perspective at things, is a kind of reflection that's relevant to Kant's conception of error in logic lectures. So error comes in when we hold something to be true, which is not true, right? So hold something false as true. So it's an act of judging. And so Kant would say, how do we discover, when we erred? Kant would say, take a step back and reflect on the grounds of our judgments. And so he has a great deal to say, right, about different kinds of grounds. And I would think this is the process, the mechanism by which we can surface what might be previously unreflected grounds of judgments and bring them to the surface. So this is our hope of discovering, right, uncovering what might be sort of previously like a pre-conscious, as Alistair was talking about. And I think this also connects with Alistair's point about implicit bias. This is something I have been interested in my graduate seminar with my graduate students, because these days we are confronted with implicit bias problem, and we kind of want to see whether Kant has any resources. And again, I think this is where Kant will say the kind of reflection, but not like atomic reflection in my own mind, but like entering the public square, right? The kind of model he's talking about in what is enlightenment, right? You basically invite other people in to help me uncover, right, my blind spots and things like that. So that's a lot, but I'm just curious what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I meant error in the innocent way, since there's no correspondence view of truth in Kant, that it's not a question of figuring out what's out there, right? I'm thinking also of Hegel's critique of certainty, that kind of thing. So I'm quite in agreement. Well, of course, what's more interesting and what's sort of in the background, or what's the central, not in the background, this is the central question, is to extend Kant's thinking into more areas than he thought could be reflected on philosophically, right? So I think that there are areas of the operations of mind which Kant thought are contingent, that turn out not to be contingent. And so Kant thought of the operations of mind in a fairly restricted way, which meant that he had to leave many things that we think about, sort of empirically speaking, which have to do with the relation. Also, we think about the unconscious bias issue here, right? I have to leave those things open, right? You say, well, Kant doesn't really have anything to say, but if we can extend, if we can create a more sort of detailed logic that can extend into the relation between different thoughts in a more sophisticated way than Kant thought, then we will be able to maybe track the contradictions in our thinking a little bit more carefully than Kant thought we were able to. So I guess that's what I was trying to channel. That's what I was trying to extend. Yes, and so of course the question is in errors of judgment, but the point that I think we can do, the point we can make is that if we make the operations of mind that are rational larger, then we can also understand more carefully the different ways in which operations of mind operate in terms of each other, right? So then, I mean, it seems to me that one of the issues that we are dealing with when we're talking about unconscious bias is not exactly that they're fully unconscious. They operate at different levels, right? So people may people may, if they're not being intentional about it, they may mean things at one level, and people take these things to mean something at a different level. Yeah, so I'm trying, in another project, I'm also a political philosopher. I'm trying to think about the different ways in which people understand the sort of political community. It's not just at the high level of, rational politics. There's a lot in politics that operates at lower levels of judgment, at more general levels of judgment, where it becomes uncontroversial to assume, some commonality about all foreigners. Let's say that is unintelligible at the highest level of thought, right? But at lower levels of thought, for instance, right, these things start to make sense. And I'm trying to extend Kant's sort of logic into those areas so that we can say something. We can think of those things appropriately as criticizable at their appropriate level. Sorry, that sort of that answer veered off a little bit, but that does bring us back to the issue of unconscious bias, which is on all of our minds, I think. So.
Okay, next up on my list is Christopher Janway.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, for some reason it's displaying my university username rather than my name, but you managed to work out who I was. Thank you. Hello to Stefan and Alistair. Good to see you both. Thank you very much for the talks. I also wanted to say a little bit more about Schopenhauer, perhaps not surprisingly. I think in a way this may be rather tangential to Stefan's overall concerns, but it seems to be a rather static view of Schopenhauer to me. I think he has the way he combines his different views of the self makes it quite a flexible and rather dynamic sort of interplay between the notion of the self as will and the self as the subject. And he introduces this notion of the subject on a second section of the book. Find ourselves as the subject. The subject is, we're aware of being what's experiencing the world. And it's kind of always a little ambiguous all the way through whether we should identify ourselves as the naturalistic will or as the cognitive subject. And it's right, of course, in some sense, there's nothing we can do to change ourselves. So I think you're right about that. The idea of that kind of therapy doesn't quite work. But there is something that can happen to us, which is negation of the will. So he doesn't leave it. We're just stuck in this predicament. He may say he thrusts us into an even more drastic predicament in a sense. But what can happen is negation of the will to life, which doesn't destroy the self. It leaves us as a subject looking out upon the world. So there's always this tension between whether we regard ourselves as the or regard ourselves as the pure subject. And in a way, though what's real is still, would be better to be a pure subject. The idea, what he doesn't call it therapy, but he calls it Erlösung, release, redemption, be to lose the will and just be a pure subject. So we have to conceive ourselves as this pure subject all along, as well as conceiving ourselves as the will. Otherwise, the sort of dynamic transition that he wants to make doesn't make sense.
Yes, thank you, and very nice to meet you. I've been reading your work in preparation for this paper, so yes, I mean, I'm of course I'm aware that I am giving Schopenhauer quite short shrift here, and there's a whole other side of Schopenhauer that I've just ignored in favor of sort of returning to Kant. And I agree that this negation of the will is important. I suppose the main problem I see in Schopenhauer is that it's a view which is in some deep sense oppositional, right? There's either the intellect or there's the will, and the two have to negotiate as if they were existing on some kind of a pressure plane, right? A pressure high one. If one gives, the other one can escape a little bit, right? But they're related in this kind of dynamic way, which I was trying to get away from, because, as I said, if you don't conceive of the will as overwhelming the intellect, which I think which is Schopenhauer's position, that it is still a little bit difficult to understand how the will would gain, how the intellect would gain enough authority to sort of do more, right? And on what authority it could properly reinvent itself. Now, I don't think that there's any kind of reinvention of the will because of this causal determinism. However, the model of the dynamic model between these two, I think, is really important. And I suppose it's really important in the sense that it is, I think, sort of for lack of a better word, a sort of a one-dimensional or two-dimensional model of human subjectivity, which has the great virtue of getting the second dimension on the table in the first place, right? And this is what I really appreciate about Schopenhauer, is that he gets the importance of nature on the table in a systematic way, in a way that we can't look away from anymore, right? And so then I think he's less good at sort of explaining once what we've done, what we do for that, what we do after that, in terms of sort of getting away from that or coming to terms with that. I mean, I guess that's where it sort of veers into Lebensphilosophie. But Lebensphilosophie itself is not something I want to dismiss. That seems to me actually something really quite important, because it goes to something that is pressing us from, we're outside of philosophy. And that's something that I think that psychoanalysis took up. It took up the kind of world pessimism that had some kind of phenomenological reality, and was saying, well, that's not just contingent, right? I mean, Kant's view doesn't concern itself with optimism or pessimism. I mean, in some ways, optimism, rational faith is a little bit different than optimism. But what Freud wants to say is that, look, these are real expressions of human subjectivity, and we should take them seriously, even if the philosophers are not. And so I was trying to find a way of bringing those kind of non-philosophical conceptions, non-philosophical worries about the human subject into philosophy. And but those have to be brought back into philosophy, by way of a differentiated model within consciousness, where, right, will and intellect, as it were, unconscious, and consciousness operate within this larger third framework, which is what I'm calling the I think somehow. But yes, of course, I'm certainly not doing justice to Schopenhauer. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, Paula Romero.
Thank you, Pavel, and thank you, Stefan, for the talk and also for the comments afterwards. I was very interested in this idea of seeing disruption as a philosophical problem, and it made me think of Kant dealing with the illusions of reason, which you talked in passing when you mentioned the dialectic, and I was thinking, to what extent your proposal or your project has implications not only for Kant's theory of judgment, but also for Kant's theory of ideas. And you could see some of these illusions, these sort of inevitable ways of thinking, as very disruptive to our mental life, and the practical implications they have, especially for our ethical life and for us as an ethical subject. So I wanted to know if you've thought about this, because as I see your project, you are sort of expanding the rational in Kant. Instead of bringing in this new irrational element into it, is trying to expand the boundaries of the rational, and illusions, at least in the dialectic, seem to be placing some sort of, I think Kant is challenging also the limits of what can be thought there. So this is just more like a comment and a question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a, yeah. Let me start by saying that, of course, that is really on my mind. I don't have much to say about the rational ideas per se, but one of the things that I think about whenever I teach, whenever I teach Kant, is the question of, where metaphysics comes from, right? Because on the one hand, Kant treats it as this problematic structure of mind that is, of course, also the condition for sort of general intelligibility, right? I mean, of course, the reason seeks the condition, the unconditioned for its conditions, right? And that is both a pathological structure and also the condition of any kind of intelligibility. Now, that is a self-referential structure seems to me really important. The question is, where do we cut off, right? Where do we say this kind of seeking of totality is legitimate and this kind of seeking of totality is illegitimate, right? And so, of course, Kant cuts off reasons in the theoretical use, thinking about totality. Now, it strikes me, though, from, of course, the psychoanalytic perspective or just an ordinary perspective, I mean, the fact that we worry about our mortality, that doesn't seem like it's absurd. It doesn't seem like something that we shouldn't worry about. We do, I mean, and the fact that we do worry about it tells me that we should be that we could be able to tell a philosophical story about that, right? So if we expand, if we go into that side, we think about what metaphysics means. Of course, we can think about metaphysics as a pathology, which is what Kant says, right? But it can't just be a pathology. If by pathology means something to be just, avoided, right? Because it's an unavoidable illusion, right? And if it's unavoidable, then it comes from something that is deep in our subjectivity. And that thing is clearly being thought by Freud in terms of the unconscious. And the inevitability of that is being thought by Freud in terms of the unconscious. So the idea in some sense is to how to get to a more, to a better explanation of the sources of that theoretically pathological thought on Kant's view, and to say how we could maybe, how in some course it will be inevitable, but in some cases how we can come to grips with it. Because that, of course, is also Kant's project. Kant's project is how to come to grips with the inevitable sort of desire of reason to go beyond itself. That's why we need a critique, right? And it seems to me that psychoanalysis is really, in many ways, offering us the same kind of critique, right? It's offering us a critique, especially in the case of the obsessive, who's Ratman is an obsessive, right? Always thinking all the time. And so what psychoanalysis is trying to do is trying to get the Ratman to think a little bit less pathologically, or to understand his thinking in a way that doesn't just mean it's an empty circle, but for his thinking to make contact with reality and therefore to be inflected by it, be given content by it, and therefore in some ways to be alleviated as this kind of pathological structure. So in that way, I see, of course, psychoanalysis and Kant's project really is fundamentally on the same page. And so that's of course a very large issue, and I was thinking along those lines. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we can take a final question to close out the official part and then move to the informal part. There's still a couple of questions, so we can kick that off with, I think, Farhad's next for the informal part. And we can come back to some of the issues perhaps that we didn't get a chance to develop. But the final question will be from Henny Blome.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk and also for the discussion. I have a question concerning what you both were agreeing on the subject of Leibniz petite perception. So there seemed to be agreement that this should be termed the pre-conscious, and in the same way that you had this tradition that was still working in 18th century German philosophy of the petite perception of Leibniz. People like Baumgarten and Meyer, they also had a conception of unconscious judgments. And this is something I was thinking about when you were talking about unconscious bias. In which way is unconscious bias? Is it prejudice? And in how far would you say can we effectively, as Meyer and Baumgarten did, term this as unconscious judgments? And I ask it because I wonder if we all also would have to say, well, this is pre-conscious judgment, in the same way that you would say the petite perception in Leibniz, these are pre-conscious representations.
Yes. Okay, so let me first say I'm really not an expert on Leibniz, so I don't have too much to say about Leibniz per se. But let me say that one of the issues with unconscious bias is that it can't just be pre-conscious, right? Because the conception of the pre-conscious is that it is available to thought. So on reflection, there's no problem. So if I say something racist and you say, hey, that's racist, I say, oh shit, that is racist. And I'm so sorry, I apologize that, you know, I mean, I might say that slipped out, or better yet, right? Really, if it's pre-conscious, I should say, I just hadn't thought about it that way, right? So that would maintain it at the level of the pre-conscious. I think when we're talking about unconscious bias, though, in a more, and this is the way, right, that cognitive psychology talks about unconscious bias, and I think that's a problematic way because cognitive psychology just assumes that we can just do a little concept clarification and do away with unconscious bias, right? And that seems to me wrong. And so, what we need is a deeper understanding of what's going on with unconscious bias, which requires us to think that it is either repressed. Of course, that's a model. If you go with that, then I think it's a little bit difficult to say where the repression comes from. All those kinds of things. Of course, there are many theories about this. The theory that I would that sort of follows from the view I've been trying to articulate is that it is not. It is a judgment of a different sort, right? It's a judgment that is operating at a different level. That's condensation of some sort, a displacement of some sort, which we can rationally get back to, right? If you say something racist and you think, oh my God, I have just conflated two things that exist, you know, that are conflated them in the wrong way. Right? And that kind of conflation we would never accept at the level of sort of the highly analytic judgment, but at the level of the sort of lower level, we conflate things all the time. And I think there's a lot in our general mental lives that sort of articulate at a lower level, and a lower level of formal logic, right? Even a way that doesn't make any sense at the level of formal logic, but makes sense at sort of a more basic level of, you know, feeling thinking or something like that. And so I think that a lot of, you know, racist speech, much speech in general, right, operates at that kind of lower level at which things are thrown together that are expressions of connections that we make out of fear, out of emotion. Right, and so I think that's where those things are located, because I think when people say things that are racist or any of the other isms that we have, right, they are saying things that are emotional, and I think that's the other important thing. So this psychoanalyst that I'm working with, Mate Blanco, he thinks that the unconscious is actually coextensive with the emotional. Right, and that's another connection to Kant, right, where I think the idea of feeling is more basic than the idea of the analytic judgments that are determinative, either theoretical or practical. So that's an important framework, I think, for thinking about these issues. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So perhaps before we bring the official part to a close, I'll mention 2 other events. The next one is our next meeting, in fact, which is on March 11th. It will take the form of a workshop on Maimon. We'll have short talks from Farhad Alavi, who I think has the next question that we'll take up in the informal part, Timothy Franz, Emily Fitton, and the response will be from Paul Franks. So that one's March 11th. And then a related event, which is the workshop on rational cosmology from the German and French Enlightenment to Kant. So that one's even earlier. That's February 25th to the 26th at KU Leuven online. Perhaps I'll put the link to that in the chat. Okay, good. So shall we move to the informal part? Big thank you to all our speakers, to our